So, hi everyone, welcome back to Ethics TV. I'm Jonathan, and today I'm finally getting to speak to Adam, who, for those of you who have watched Ethics, when we started Ethics TV, there was, I think, the first day, a friend of mine was the first viewer, and then there was four viewers of one video, and it's not about reaching people, but I remember when it got to the first 10 viewers. Now that was tens of thousands of viewers ago, bizarrely. And probably the first citation I ever made was of a paper by the person you're now watching on this show, which it just blows my mind because I mentioned you to Prashant, who I was speaking about morality and the decline, the perceived decline of morality over the generations, and whether we have become less moral. And I mentioned you, and then I said in passing on that Ethics TV episode, I said, and I'm going to see if I can get Adam Mastroianni onto the show. And I realized that to get you on the show, the first thing I needed to do was actually email you, because I'd kind of always in my head thought about interviewing you, but hadn't actually sent a correspondence, which probably is a function of whether or not you are likely to appear. So, long story short, thank you so much for joining.
Of course, glad to be here.
So there are so many different places to start, but the first, I guess, the place that I would like to start is when you describe what it is that you're interested in. What do you, and this isn't necessarily the horrible dinner party question of what is it that you do? How do you describe what it is that you're the most interested in to people?
I guess I would say I feel like I experience a series of demonic possessions, and the only way to get them out is to find the right words to write about them and exorcise them. That I mean, I got my start being trained as a social psychologist, so I was and remain interested in a lot of things like how do people think the world has changed and how has it actually changed? How do people understand each other? How do people understand themselves? But since I left academia and now I write a blog full time, it's still about that, but it's also about so much more. It's about how do we know we're making progress in psychology and in science, and how do we make more of that? How do we have better conversations is something I write a lot about. How do we find our place in the world? And all of these things feel like they come into my being unbidden, and I can't stop thinking about them unless I figure out how to express them properly as a blog post, and then they leave me alone, and then there's the next one.
A true
Yeah,
exorcism.
yeah, yes,
Mm.
yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, if I don't find the right words, they never go away.
In terms of psychology, then, is that actually a thing that an unexpressed I'm going to try and use my words carefully here, but an unexpressed emotion could, in practice, be um, be somehow manifesting in a way that would be unfortunate. And so the expression of an emotion negates some form of unnecessary manifestation. Do these things correlate?
What it sounds like to me is like describing the Zeigarnik effect, which is this like old finding in psychology where if you stop someone in the middle of something that they're doing, their thoughts will return to that thing like automatically and unbidden, right? So like if you are in the middle of, I was thinking of organizing your sock drawer, something more interesting than that, most likely. Like if you're in the middle of eating a sandwich and someone's like, "Hey, can you help me like go do this thing?" Your thoughts will like once you're done doing that other thing, your thoughts will naturally return to like I was in the middle of eating a sandwich,
Yeah.
and there's this feeling of like it's wrong to just leave that behind. Like it's wrong to just like leave a task that I was invested in the middle of it. And I guess like writing for me and exploring these ideas has felt like experiencing the Zygarnik effect at all times, which
Mm.
is that there is this thought that is not complete that needs to be completed. And like I won't be able to think clearly about other things until I finish this one. I'm making this sound more obsessive than it turns out to be. Like this doesn't ruin my life. It's like more motivational, but like it does feel very strong. Like it grabs my attention. That's why I keep doing it.
Yeah, well, that seems like a good enough reason. Um, when when you wrote, well, I think the first paper, the decline in morality or the perceptions of morality over time, theme to me was something that I had intuitively wondered. It had occurred to me that people always talk about how things were better back then, or we were a more moralistic species then, or whatever. And there was two parts. One was the morality over time, or the declining morality over time, or the perceived declining morality over time. And the other was whether in general our perception of the past and the present is is not only heavily biased, but tends to be predictably irrational. Um, which is the morality, is the perception of morality over time a just a one of many examples of our weird way that we look at the past and the future or the present and things being better or worse. And morality is just one example of that. In the
Mm,
same way as someone could say that any form, their neighborhood was better in the past, or their neighborhood was safer in the past than it is now. I remember when we didn't have to lock our doors and our kids could play outside at night time, these type of statements. And the
mhm,
decline, the perceived decline of morality, is that inside the same component as that?
mhm. Yeah, yeah. I do think that what causes people to believe there's been a decline, even when there hasn't been, um, it comes from a like common source of cognitive bias. In fact, I think two of them. One is this bias toward paying attention to negative information. And this isn't specific to thinking about the future or the past. It's even specific to thinking about the world in general. This is, I think, a useful way for a mind to work if it wants to survive in an environment where downside risks tend to be extremely down, like you might die, and upside risks can be very up, but there's no positive infinity that you can experience, but there are negative infinities where you get eaten by a leopard or you fall off a cliff. So it makes sense to pay attention to possible dangers in your environment. It makes sense that negative things would draw our attention more, and I think that is one ingredient of the bias toward thinking that things are getting worse. And the other, and that's enough to make it so that when you look out at the world, it always looks like it's pretty bad. But you need a
Mm,
second bias to make it seem like it only recently got that way, or it only got that
mm,
way over time. And that's the fading affect bias. So this comes out of the memory literature where the negativity of negative information tends to fade faster than the positivity of positive information. So like basically good things in the mind last longer than bad things.
mm,
And this is also makes this isn't it didn't evolve to help us think about how things are changing over time. It most likely evolved to help us live satisfied lives where we don't waste our lives regretting the things that we've done, and to help us behave adaptively. But the side effect is that when this combines with the first bias, is that you can get this illusion where every day it looks like things are bad, but it seems like things used to be better yesterday.
mm.
So, like, I do think that this particular illusion comes out of biases that exist in the mind for other reasons.
Uh, And is there a part of our loss aversion that seems to be driving so many things in human nature that is a factor to that? I mean, there are some commentators that would say that our, I mean, they generalize and say that our entire mindset is geared towards loss aversion, either of, or parts of loss aversion that generate then fear of things that we could lose and regret of things that we have lost and are almost are steering towards the hyperbolic discounting of taking 50 cents now versus waiting 3 years for $50 because we don't know whether that $50 will ever come is so high, 80+% skewed, let's say, of whoever the N equals, that we are in a situation of permanent loss aversion that kind of speaks to what you're saying, that maybe there's the evolutionary balance that we've kind of had to temper our loss aversion. We've had to upweight positive uh,
Mm,
uh, memories if nothing else than to make life manageable. Otherwise, if the negative feelings and negative thoughts and emotions lasted longer with our loss aversion, then we probably would do nothing. We'd be in stasis the whole time
Mhm.
because there'd be no purpose for anything,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah, it's important to feel the negative emotions that come from a bad thing happening so that you can learn to avoid it in the future. But once you've extracted that information from it, you don't actually need it to feel bad for you anymore, right? Like you need to understand that, like, oh, I shouldn't walk near that edge anymore, or else I might fall over it like I did the last time. Um, but if you're far from the ledge, you don't need to be thinking about like, oh man, that was a really scary ledge and I fell over and it really hurt myself. Like you need to be able to take the information that's necessary and leave behind the rest of it and move on with your life so you can take in more information and learn new things. So yeah, I think it totally makes sense that the mind has this tendency to distance ourselves from things, to reframe them, to distract from them over time, and that we have reason to apply all of those things to negative information much more than positive, right? There's no reason why you need to rationalize a good thing that happened to you. And so it loses less of its potency and memory over time. That makes sense to me anyway.
Yeah. In the there's a term, mass formation psychosis, that has been used, especially in recent times in the COVID-19 situation, and various people have spoken of different ways of classing that, whether, mass hysteria, or one could, let's soften this and say, groupthink or herd mentality, or the many minds of people together. Um, I'm fascinated by. I need to ask you this question because you're probably the only person I've had on Ethics TV that I think is most certainly has the letters after his or her name to answer it in a way that I can at least think that you've done the research required to have an answer that I can at least start with. Um, we have a situation where we as individuals of big technology sign terms and conditions that we don't read, that sometimes in the case of some big tech platforms are longer than the Magna Carta, and it's unlikely that any human would read them. We're then told that the terms and conditions that we've signed are include the fact that when you publish a picture of your loved one or sibling or son or daughter, whoever, the intellectual property rights of that picture are now owned by the platform, and they can monetize and do what they wish with it. And that's a perpetual situation. You're told, you find out this, you're told this, and you're told that it was because you signed the terms and conditions, or rather you didn't uncheck the box or whatever it was, the mechanic. And it seems to me that the majority of people then shrug and say, well, that's just the way it is. And I want to ask you whether that is symbolic of a human behavior that you've observed in any other context, because it seems to me that there's an apathy or a choice supportive bias in place that says, you've just told me that my fundamental human rights of identity have been abused. However, you also told me that I was the person that didn't uncheck the box. Therefore, net, it is what it is. And I've wanted to ask someone about this who
Yeah.
has the qualifications to at least comment, and that's you.
Well, there's I think two relevant psychological forces that I think are at play there. One is what we think of as like consistency effects. That if I can get you to make a decision without really thinking about it, you're now much more motivated to justify the decision that you've made if I press you on it. And so people have taken advantage of this. In laboratory studies or in field studies where you get people to agree to a small request and then you ask them for a larger request in the same domain because now they're the kind of person who agrees to requests like that. Like will you give 25 cents to my charity? Like well, anybody, well, that's not that much money. Okay, 25. So, well, how about $10 now? Because now you're the kind of person who cares about this thing. And so if I've already signed the thing, and you're like, hey, you signed this thing, now I feel some motivation to be consistent with what I've already done, and maybe in part the way that I justify it is by thinking, well, it wasn't that big of a deal, and like that's why it was fine for me to do. That's one force that seems like it's at play. The other is I don't know if we have a great name for this exactly, but the world is really ambiguous. It's hard to know which decisions to make. And so, in large part, we outsource our decision making to other people. We look at what they do and we do what they do. And it's easy to like make fun of us for that, but this is as I think the anthropologist Joe Henrich has argued really persuasively, like this is what makes humans really successful. Like chimps actually can't do this, ants can't do this, and this is why like we run the zoos and the animals live in them, is that we are able to transmit information that one person learns to many people very quickly. And in large part, the way we do that is by looking at other people and mimicking them or learning from them. And so when you're on a platform like Facebook and you look at the fact that like, well, everybody else is here posting pictures, so it must be fine. Like if other people were, deleting their Facebook accounts on account of like this abusive end user license agreement, I would be much more likely to do it too. But like we're all in this room where we're all waiting for the other person to move first, and because no one is moving first, this we call like pluralistic ignorance. That like we all might have a feeling about something, but if I don't see evidence that you feel that way, and you don't see evidence that I feel that way, because I'm waiting for you to move and you're waiting for me to move, like we all just keep posting our wedding pics on Facebook and assuming that like how bad could it be if everybody's doing it?
Yeah. Well, that seems comprehensively accurate. In which case, I mean, this is now potentially outside of your field of being able to wanting to comment, but so what does it take for pluralistic ignorance to be
Yeah,
adjusted? What does it
yeah.
take?
It takes somebody to move, and uh, and you basically have to hit a critical mass of people who are doing the other kind of behavior, or you have to somehow find a way to spread the information that even though we're all behaving in this way, we don't want to get people out of the situation that they're stuck in. And like activism online it's like very easy to critique that like, oh, it's just people sitting at home clicking buttons, it doesn't really change the world. This is actually a lever that I think is pretty good at changing. That 10 years ago when there were these movements on Facebook that like everybody change your profile picture to look like this, and then a bunch of people were like, oh, you don't actually change the world by doing that. Well, like actually you can. If I thought that like, well, I'm sure no one in my social network like supports like same-sex marriage, and now all of a sudden everyone has changed their profile picture to be in support of same-sex marriage. Like I get information that I didn't have before, and that is, I think, something that social media can uniquely do that's really hard to get any other way. But it takes something like that. So if I logged onto Instagram and I saw a bunch of people who had like printed out their end user license agreements and they were like burning them or something, and then you see a video of them like smashing their phone, deleting their Instagram account, I'd be like, oh, okay, other people are upset about this. Maybe I should be upset about this too. That is what I think
Mm,
it would take: some smash phones
mm.
and burned papers.
Yeah. It's interesting when I've been speaking on stage about the the kind of ripple effect of small behavior, um, less of the atomic habits part, but more of the growing tribe of decisioning. One of the examples I use is the fall of the Berlin Wall and how that started with a few students, like literally two, three students, um, uh, rallying. I guess if you can call a rally two people, I guess a rally includes two people, but. The fall of the Berlin Wall is a story, I believe, a lesser reported story of what happens when a couple of people have a thought and then a few other people realize that the thought that they had isn't such a bad thought after all. And then it gets to a stage where the amount of people who have the thought far outweighs the ability to police the people who have the thought. And so there is enough historical precedent around what we're talking about here. The burning phones and or smashing phones and burning end user agreements is it's not too outrageous to imagine happening at some stage. And I can't even remember why we stopped using MySpace. All I remember is that there was one month when everyone was using MySpace, and then
Yeah,
6 months later, no one was using MySpace, and that's really strange, right?
yeah, yeah.
You must have seen examples like this throughout your whole of your research, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's this video that that people love to show in psychology classes. There's this like very old YouTube video of people hanging out in a park and there's music playing and there's one
Yeah,
person dancing. Yeah, you know this. Yes.
yeah.
The idea being that like you kind of need that one person who doesn't care about other people, that like
Mhm.
they teeter toward being sociopathic, like so little do they care about other people. But that person lowers the threshold for the next person, the person who cares a little bit about looking ridiculous, and they lower the threshold for the next person who cares a little bit more about looking ridiculous, until eventually you line up enough of those people that now it looks ridiculous to not be in the mosh pit. Uh,
Mm,
and like, where do you get that one person? I don't know. That person seems a little bit crazy, and like it's a good
mm,
thing that humans are so diverse that we often have someone who's extreme in whatever way that's necessary. And then you have to like somehow ratchet down the barriers for other people. But clearly,
mm.
it's possible, right? That like the exodus from MySpace to Facebook is one of these. That like, who was the person who first started using Facebook other than Mark Zuckerberg, or like who was really like the 500th person?
Mm.
The kind of person who's like, I just like using something because it's like cool and new. And that person made it easier for the next person and the next person.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that
yeah.
mobile networks have a map of influence. They don't speak about this in public, but they have a map of who who the subscribers are that actually mean that the second tier subscribers are still subscribing. And
Mhm.
they know who these people are, and they know that if they were to unsubscribe, the the macro influences, then the impact would be catastrophic. And so they do whatever it takes. They and obviously I'm speaking of no one particular network here, and there's no so I'm not going to walk myself into legal trouble, but um, everything that you could imagine that's done favorably for those particular people is done, including
Mhm.
better signal, including lower prices, including larger data bundle, including faster phone upgrades, including X, Y, and Z. Because there is a section of people that in every network that has an overwhelming influence on the rest. And
Mhm.
um, I've do, I have, however, an adjacent question. Though we could keep going down that line, there's something that sprung to mind that I'm desperate to hear your thoughts on. In the US, you have the Constitution, and globally, we have, although not linked to a constitutional right, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on the United Nations site. So we have these, let's call them manifestos to some extent, or well, constitutions that have either in the constitutional side of things a regulatory or legislatively upholdable framework. So people can say, well, this is actually an abuse of my X amendment of the Constitution, therefore this is wrong. Within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there seems to be a more looser placement of these things onto the behavior of us all. Do you feel that in general, placing frameworks stroke legislature or stroke regulation is a way of influencing responsible behavior in general? Or have you
Mhm.
found that um, guiding people into behavior of responsibility is less effective if one says this is right and this is wrong?
Mhm.
What have you observed?
Yeah, this I think comes a little bit more from first principles and values than like any particular scientific papers that I've read, but I feel like the point of rules is to coordinate behavior. That it is helpful for us all to know what the expectations are for our behavior and what the consequences might be for not following those expectations. I think there is a I think a naive view that like by instituting the rule, you compel people to do something.
Mm,
That like we can make people better by subjecting them to the right rules. I don't think that's entirely wrong. That like it's better to have good rules than bad rules. But like the rules don't make people do things. Like people can
mm.
choose to abide by them or not, right? The person who enforces the rules, like there's who watches the Watchmen problem. That like
That's
at
right.
some point somebody has to obey this rule because they want to, not because
Yeah,
the rule has some kind of metaphysical power over them. And so,
yeah.
really, what we want to do is form the kind of humans who like obey the right rules, rather than use the rules to force humans to conform. I think you see
Mm,
this show up all the time, especially in organizations where, I mean, there's a thing called Goodhart's law, where once a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. That like if the rule is now, you need to score, you need to get all A's or else you don't get promoted to the next class. Well, what you're going to do is like incentivize people to cheat to get the A's, or like devalue what it means to be an A, or to get an A. And so like we think that we can move people around by like writing different things in a document. And it's not that we are unable to do so, but I think we're only able to do so through the route of those rules being a reflection of the things that people think and value,
mm.
rather than those rules themselves having some kind of force.
Yeah.
Which is why it's possible to like there's no written rules in your friend group, but there are clearly expectations that if you don't live up to them, like people will be mad at you. And like you don't make a better friend group by writing down all the things that like you will respond to my text within 30 minutes or else you'll have to apologize. That like those things can be looser because everyone in a friend group is motivated to do the things that make the friend group work. And like you won't make it better by forcing people to do things that they don't already want to do. You make a friend group the best, I think, by picking the right friends in the first place, rather than trying to perfect the one that you've encountered.
Yeah. So this is a first principles point. It's my dad always said about he had a kind of Shakespearean analogy, I guess, and he said the problem with the third act is often the problem of the first. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, you can criticize the third act. However, the characters you're criticizing in their entire story was origined several acts
Mm-hmm.
earlier. So let's look at the
Yeah.
actual problem as opposed to the outcome
Yeah.
of the problem. So I'm interested, for instance, therefore, with there's some AI uh, legislation that's been touted. On one hand, there's AI regulators who say the way that we're going to regulate is we're going to send a report into the companies that they have to fill in, and they have to tick a box to say that they have an ethical framework in place. They have to self-report, and then they send that back to us, and then we look at the check box and we go, they've checked the box, therefore they're ethically responsible in their AI, right? And then there's other touted views, which is we're going to any computer that has over this volume of computing power, we want to legislate very carefully, or regulate very carefully, I should say. And there are fines if our regulation isn't upheld. And that's recently been kicked out as a proposal because not because of the unrealism of it, and not because of how it would be policed, let alone the Il Custodes El Custodiat, the who guards the guards issue that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
The reason it was being kicked out is because it only was regulating the large companies, whereas the small ones could act um, freely and therefore potentially irresponsibly. So the whole proposition has been killed due to the fact that it isn't comprehensive enough.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm getting to, and you'll have seen this one coming, is how would you police an ethically responsible, police is the wrong word, how would you guide an ethically responsible technology landscape apart from enabling the education of engineers and computer scientists to be more aware ethically? And is there any other way than a first principles argument of starting at the Act One? Is there anything we can do in Act Three
Mm.
that is anywhere near uh, giving us a chance to be what I believe, and obviously the Sam Harrises or Nick Boströms of the world would say even further, a kind of existential risk of artificial intelligence. What could we do
Mm.
now other than saying we need to start with the kids, man, and
Yeah.
education, and what else could we do?
Yeah, yeah. I guess it depends on who the we is. So I think if this is something that you really cared about, I might say that the most effective thing that you could do is like rather than try to get legislation passed, like try to join one of these companies to embody the values that you think are important and to try to make friends with other people who you think are friendly to those values and basically try to make your side win through being a better side, like through being cooler. Um, which because like when it comes to this kind of person who's like going to push the button to produce the doomsday AI, like which thing would you rather stop that person? The idea that like if I push this button, a man with a gun might show up and like try to put me in jail. I've already pushed the button at that point.
Yeah.
Or do you want the thing that stops him to be he doesn't want to push the button? Um,
Mm,
and like the way to make that person not want to push the button is probably to find that person and try to convince them, like try to befriend them and explain like why you care about this. That this doesn't work obviously if you have no interest in like being part of the technology industry in the first place. But I guess if you never had that, then maybe you're better off just not worrying about it and figuring out what is the analogy of this in the realm that you do care about. Right? Like I would like there to be good AI legislation, but I really know nothing about it. So it's not going to be the thing that I spend my time on. But
mm,
I care a lot about science policy, and like that is a thing that I spend a lot of time like talking to a lot of people about to try to get my side to win, basically by being cooler, by like having more friends, and by making better arguments. Um,
yeah. You also,
which I think is yeah,
yeah, I get what you're saying. And by the way, you, from an outside perspective, from an observer, you are extraordinarily approachable in how you write and the way
thank
that
you.
you make it's. There's very few examples where I think there must be some form of personality perspective here on your side because you don't seem to apply the standard male alpha ego chest pumping side of things. You make it almost almost too inviting and acceptable. The way that you write is to the every person, and that's it's extremely refreshing. But that then leads me to my kind of the final theme that I wanted to explore because I've been saving up questions for you for quite a while now. Um, Recently, Terrence Howard was on the actor stroke thinker was on Joe Rogan, and Neil deGrasse Tyson had critiqued one of Terrence Howard's um, papers on this kind of new mathematical model of the universe and so forth, and um, there was this conversation basically that took place where another one of Joe Rogan's guests, Brett Weinstein, was talking about how the scientific method um, is is problematic because there is this kind of walled garden to some extent where I'm kind of paraphrasing his, but us scientists believe that no one should enter the garden. If you haven't got peer-reviewed papers and you haven't been published and you haven't been this, there, therefore what you're saying is nonsense until you do these things. And I guess the conversation was using Terence Howard in the middle as the tennis ball was essentially Weinstein versus deGrasse Tyson. deGrasse Tyson saying, "How dare you come to our dinner party without bringing a 1973 bottle of Chateau Margaux? If you don't bring that bottle of wine, then you can't come in." Whereas Weinstein saying, "Listen, we need new thinking to come in, and let's not be hierarchically snobbish about this." Whereas and then there's Terence Howard in the middle of this, who to be generous, is either this miracle visionary sage, or high as a kite, batshit crazy. So and we don't know where, but that maybe that's the point of genius, is that there's a very fine line between you could, in the same way as you could imagine that Tesla is either completely nuts or completely miraculous, where do you draw the line? So your approachability that I've noticed seems to be along the lines of welcome everyone to science. Does that extend to new thinking from externally non-published, non-peer-reviewed authors as well?
Absolutely. In fact, even more so than the people who have the credentials. I think because they're well represented, they're well taken care of. They have they have plenty of institutions that will serve them and where they can go to get money and security, whereas nobody else does. Nobody who's trying to do science outside of the mainstream legacy institutions does. And I just don't believe that the only good ideas exist inside those institutions. And I think plenty of bad ideas exist outside them, but plenty of bad ideas exist inside them too. Uh, and something that I wrote a while ago that like is very foundational in my thinking about this is that science is a strong link problem. That like not all problems have the structure, but science does, where it really matters the quality of our best work. Like our bad work fades away through disuse, and like it's not always a painless process, and it doesn't happen immediately, but there is a reason why we are able to make progress over time, and it's because when an idea is clearly better than the next best one, like that's the one that sticks around. And it's not because someone decides that it should stick around; it sticks around because like people choose to keep using it. Like this is another thing you can't legislate. Like in the short term, you can promote one idea versus another, and you can use artificial means to make it succeed. In the long term, that doesn't work. And like they saw this in like the in Soviet Russia, where they were like, Western genetics is it's counter-revolutionary, and forget about these genes. Like we can do things through just like grafting plants because for whatever reason this is more amenable to Soviet thought. And like millions of people starved. Like you can't by fiat make genetics work one way and not another. And like the
Mm.
reason why Western genetics, their word, not mine, ultimately succeeded is because like it could do more things.
Mm.
Like the people who looked at it really closely were more convinced by this model than the other model. And like I guess I believe this because I believe in truth, and I believe like truth is more powerful than things that are false. And so I actually don't think it needs to be aided by people who are trying to decide at the moment an idea enters the world which one should be let in. And I don't think that this is actually possible. It takes too long for these things to play out. So,
Mm.
so yeah, absolutely. This is part of why I'm working on building an institution to support more people who are doing more stuff outside of academia. It's why I run a Discord for them. It's why I'm always talking to them on the internet, because I believe like, yeah, probably 98% of this stuff is going to go nowhere, but 2% of it might end up being really, really important. And that's the
Mm.
stuff that I care about. So I am perfectly happy to read 100 bad ideas for the two that change the world. That seems
Mm.
actually like a great trade. I'd make it every time.
Me too. In the same way as in raising money for ideas, I've realized that it's the no's that you hear from investors are at least as important as the yeses, potentially more important than the yeses. The yeses is the happy path. They say yes, you say great, they write a check, you put money into the business that you're building, fine. When they say no, at worst, what you do is this is like the lowest learning of a no is you look at yourself and think, you look at what you're doing and think, which part of it didn't they like? And then you can then choose to discount that and go, well, they're wrong, right? That's the lowest denominator. At best, what a no is a mirror of, or showing you a mirror of how, or rather, even it's not even a mirror, it's an alternate perspective of what you thought you were doing right through the lens of someone who thinks that what you're doing sucks. And surely anyone who wants to innovate would embrace as many of those perspectives as possible to have a far fuller um, picture. And so, but it's taken me 3 decades to really digest that view because I could have said it 20 years ago or 25, 30 years ago and not really meant it. And then, to be honest, even the
Yeah,
last 5, 10 years, I'd have said it in fear. It sounds like a platitude almost. It's like,
yeah, yeah.
every no gets you towards a yes. It's like, but truthfully, in terms of if we are looking to learn, if the objective is how can we learn to make this better, then there's no no's and yeses. It's just learning. If we genuinely, and it doesn't, we don't need to adopt a super stoic mindset to have that. It's literally every response gives you a learning. The question is whether you're aware of that learning opportunity or whether the ego mind the kicks in and goes, how dare you say no to me? Because as soon as you say that, then the learning stop, the ability to learn shuts down. But it's taken me so long. And I'm wondering
Mm.
from in the science community, was there an element of being proven wrong? The risk of being proven wrong, and this is my last question to you actually, but this is kind of like where I was hoping we'd get to. it, it that my amateur take of the scientific method is find stuff that can be proven isn't comprehensively true and break it and break it and break it until we can find a new paradigm. And then when we found that new paradigm, question it and break it and break it and break it until we find a new paradigm. That's my very, very badly termed scientific method, which seems to go in the face, and I'm kind of super paraphrasing Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions there. It seems to go in the face of the behavior of a hierarchical inner sanctum society, where it's like you can't say that this is a new thing because you're not inside our society. But if the
Hmm.
society is to break things to make new things and then break things and make new things to reach our objective truths at that time in that paradigm, surely that society wouldn't have a personality that is exclusive. It would be
Hmm.
inclusive so that it could feed the finding of new paradigms. And I've never
Yeah.
understood that in my head. That's what I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, yeah. No, what you're saying makes sense. All of that would make total sense if that's the way that mainstream academic institutions worked. And it is not at all how mainstream academic institutions worked. I think mainly because they get caught up with science being a status game, where I increase in status by publishing papers. And the way I publish papers is by obeying the rules of my field and not making people upset. A big part of it in psychology is by publishing significant results. So studies that quote unquote worked rather than studies that didn't. Um, a way that I succeed too is by outcompeting other hypotheses by preventing them from ever being published. So there was some reporting suggesting that like there was an Alzheimer's cabal that tried to stop the success of any competing theory for a long time, and like I wouldn't be so mad about that if we were really good at treating Alzheimer's. If like the first sign you showed of Alzheimer's, you went in and like, oh yeah, here you go, and like now you're cured. At that point, it'd be like, okay, yeah, you guys, I guess, can try excluding alternative theories, but we don't have anything. And so the idea that we are so certain about the leading theory that we shouldn't even entertain the possibility of other ones, like, is anti-scientific. It's anti-human. But it is, I think, pretty much business as usual inside universities, which is a big reason why I'm so interested in building alternative institutions, because I think it's really hard to overcome that, because like everyone who is a decision maker is like in that same kind of like space of thought. And so if you want to do something different, like you kind of have to build a completely different space. Um, so yeah, what you're making makes total sense, except it's not at all how things work.
Good. Well, that's in the true scientific method. That has at least taught me what the issues with my hypothesis, and I've now formed a clearer conclusion. So, where can people find out about your work and how? I mean, personally, I didn't realize that you had the Discord group. I'm going to be joining that within 7 minutes. So,
Mm.
there's your website, which I've put in the description here. What else should people be aware of that you're doing, and where should they look for your stuff?
Yeah, everything is on my Substack, which is called Experimental History. So everything I do goes there in one way or another.
Good. Okay, good stuff. So yeah, I've put that link in the description, which is the experimental-history.com Substack, I imagine. It's the best
Yep.
one.
Yep.
Um, and I'm gonna, yeah, I mean, this is great. I'm gonna link this to everyone. Adam, thanks so much. And at least for nothing else than putting up with my newbie questions that I've been waiting to speak to someone like you about, well, you specifically. So I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Good to talk to you.